Okay, we are here going to have a nice chat between two folks who know each other. I mean, we know each other, but not great. I hope today we get to learn a little bit more about ourselves. And one thing to clarify for those that will watch this is we're here talking on our own behalf. We are not here talking on behalf of anyone we might work with or any of those things. We're talking about some experience, and we're talking about issue. This is one of those issues where the temperature is high, but the understanding is often low. So today we're going to focus on clarity, what's really happening, what works, and what responsibilities we all share as a community. We're talking about those fellow citizens that are unhoused, the kind of work that happens on the front line, maybe some of the experience that you might have, Misty, on the front line. So I look forward to having a chat. It's not political, it's about humanity today. And I've followed you for a long time. Online, I would describe you, and I mean it as a term of endearment, courageous, fierce, committed, passionate, intelligent. That's what I've observed in you. And I admire that because, I think in communities can only get better when we're honest about the challenges that we face. And, that goes for recreation and potholes. But when we're talking about people that are our fellow citizens, that are living in tents under trees, couch surfing, those kinds of things. That's where people like you, in my opinion, Misty, are so vital to a system. Folks get very uncomfortable. Is that the right way? Is that the right word?
Absolutely.
We can swear too, by the way. Like I don't know what rules exist in the podcast world, but YouTube and Facebook might take us off. But before we get into all of that, I'd just love to know a bit more about you. Like, what's your story? What's your background? The pieces you're willing to share with us.
Yeah, I came to St. John from Ontario, and I, grew up in care. I was homeless at a young age. I used substances, and I had a daughter in my early 20s, and she sort of changed things around for me. And I worked really hard. I was a high school dropout. And when my daughter was a few years old, I remember reading a study that, if you are a parent who doesn't have a high school diploma, the chances of your children not having a high school diploma is higher. So I went to university, got a BA in law, and could not find a job in Ontario. So I opened a business and realized that I did not like retail. I would have people come in who couldn't afford things, and I would give stuff away for free. And so that's not really a good
That's
way
not
to
a great
be
business model.
owner. And so after a certain point, I was working on my business for about 5 years, and I just was not enjoying it. So I decided that me and my kids were going to go on a vacation. So we put all of our stuff into a storage unit, and we packed up my truck, and we drove across Canada and just camped and explored. And it was an amazing summer. We came to St. John, and I absolutely fell in love with it. I love the fact that I know people say there's humidity here, but there's really not. I just loved everything about it. I liked the lack of traffic. I liked the old buildings, the history, being close to the ocean. And so, my kids were like, we want to stay. And this was before coming here was cool. So
you were a trendsetter.
Yeah. And so I was like, well, if I can, find a job, then we'll stay. And I sent out one resume and had a job for more money than I'd ever made in my life.
So was that in law?
Nope,
no?
That was initially it was at a youth shelter. And so then we just ended up staying, and now I've been here for almost 9 years. And a couple of years ago, I bought a house in the Old North End, and I'm never going to leave. I'm probably going to die in that house.
Wow, beautiful. What a story of resilience, right? I mean, it's interesting. A couple things. I mean, so would you say, you went to school, law degree, and then, you sort of go on this journey of exploration, if you will. We did one of those trips as well. Oh my gosh, what a blessing. I mean, we're so grateful, we know. And people would post, oh my gosh, I'm so jealous, and I'm so this and that. And I would try to say, look, we're not doing that to, we understand we're blessed, but boy, I have this theory that if there should be, here's my idea, if anyone from the Department of Education is listening, there should be a fleet of vehicles. And you graduate from high school. There's a little envelope of cash in the glove box, and you should travel around. Go across the country. I've had the blessing of driving across the country a couple of times, and the big trip that Patty and I did. Now, mind you, like you saved for that for 30 years. We went all around North America over 9 months. I mean, obviously, again, feel like we won the lottery. Like there's a searching there that, there's when you have time, and now, we're going to get into, all kinds of discussion about our basic needs, being met. So certainly realize that, if your basic needs aren't met, kind of hard to dream, kind of hard to, to have time for self-reflection. Right. So, but I just find it so interesting that, you went on your own journey. Your story you shared about your early years reading something. So if I don't get this education, and if I don't, work hard at this, it's going to be a tough gig, right? Yeah. But you come here, and you could have easily, like that first person that said yes to Misty, could have been a law firm too. And where would now I get this sense in my gut that if that had been the case, I don't know if Misty would have lasted in law, unless it was like social justice.
I think partway through my degree, I realized that I would probably spend a significant more time with contempt of court charges, And I have a lot of respect for lawyer Cindy Blackstock, is one of my absolute idols. And I still kind of joke about going and, writing the LSAT and going to law school, maybe when I'm older. But I think that the kind of change happens in community, not so much in the courtroom. So I would miss out on a lot.
Sure. Can we just pull that a little bit? Just maybe we'll pull out. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So, and then do you have your social work?
So I worked for a couple of years, and I found that it's an interesting dynamic in St. John. There's a lot of people out there that don't have degrees or designations, and I don't think it's a St. John thing. I think it's like a world thing, who aren't necessarily taken as seriously as other people, even if they have more experience and knowledge. And so what I found was that continuously, even though I knew things, it wasn't being taken as seriously. So I did go and get my BSW out of spite, and I worked full time and did the online degree at Dow. And I did the BSW in 20 months. It was absolutely wild. I was very, very busy. And so now I also have a BSW.
Right.
And that was...
that resonates with me also, and I carry a lot of, we'll talk, I'm sure, at some point in our discussion about trauma, mental health, addictions, and we have a lot of all of those things in our own family. And I think the more we talk about this, the more we normalize, the more we destigmatize. And I think that there's lots of trauma on both sides of my family, right? I mean, on my mom's side, my mom was born when her dad was at war, so she didn't know him when he came home. Of things there. And then on my dad's side, my grandfather was an abusive alcoholic, and some of my family get very upset when I talk about things like this. But if you don't say it out loud, how do you learn? How do you deal with it? How do you, and my dad was a great man who I love. Both my parents are gone now, but he was an alcoholic his entire life. And I say, he never found really the courage to address the trauma but I've not recently, over the last decade or so, come to really realize that cascading impact of that trauma in our DNA, in our system, whether you recognize that or not, it's there. And how do we sort of deal with that, right? And then the piece I just want to pick up on as well, and I agree with you 100% around, the piece of paper, and I'm not dismissing the value of education from secondary institutions, universities, colleges, and those things. But, I don't have a degree. I graduated from high school. I wanted to get into because I wanted to fly. I wanted to be a
Mm-hmm.
helicopter pilot. Maybe not too late. They're recruiting.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah,
know, can an
absolutely.
old guy with a bad knee and bad eyesight get
Yeah.
into the military? Make a comment below, which will be no. So I couldn't get in the military at the time. And then, you know, I had my roommate's name at Dal. I think it was Henderson House at Dal, and I was going to take arts. I should have taken business. My dad was a university prof at UMB. And, you know, if he had said jump, I would have sat at the time. And, you know, we were just at odds with each other. And I think it would have served me well. But anyway, and it just came time to go to school. And in July or August came around, and I just said to my mom, like, I'm not going to go. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think my brain is ready for it. I'm not going to go. And so my path is a longer journey,
Yeah.
a journey of very hard work. My dad was an alcoholic. I was a workaholic. And I've, you know, I'm proud of my achievements, but you're right. I mean, you know, some people sort of judge us on, we know it. We do the stigmas, right? On our looks. We identify with our gender, our skin color, how many university degrees we have. And I think we're missing out on, from an inclusion perspective, you know, some brilliant people that, I mean,
100%.
again, like we have to all show up in different ways. We
Yeah.
need that intellect. We need that theory, but we need that practicality as
Yeah.
well, right? So I want to talk a bit about, you know, obviously we have a wonderful city. You know, it's having been the former mayor, I'm very proud of this city. It's a beautiful city. The people are caring and kind. You know, there's all kinds of things going for us.
Yep.
And because two things can be true at once,
Yes.
we have a lot of people left behind.
Yes.
And I think COVID was very difficult. You know, my time, there was little growth. I mean, you know, in life, if we could have a time machine and do over some things,
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
we would do some things differently. COVID was very difficult. We saw more people move to this region than in 20 years previous, maybe 40. We saw a massive spike in rental prices. We saw that push a lot of people out to the street. We saw massive price spike in real estate, you know, all overall rental purchase. And we've seen stagnation, you know, like inflation. We've seen 40% thereabouts. You would know the numbers better than me, of St. Johners don't make a living wage. You know, we've seen record numbers of social challenge around the unhoused. And mental health, addictions, you know, for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think, you know, so I guess as a starting point, how would you describe where we are right now? You know the front line, you know a lot, you know probably everyone that works on the front line. Where are we right now? How serious is this?
I think that as somebody who has lived all across Canada, and it's a reason that I resonate with your travel, because I think that if some people got outside of St. John and then came back, they would have a lot more appreciation for our city. I think that something that people don't talk about often is the fact that St. John is also a city that doesn't necessarily like change. One of the things that sort of affected everything is that as protections increased across Canada, newer legislation for the RTA, zoning, accessibility legislation, you know, building practices and codes and that sort of thing. St. John was kind of, you know, in some of those situations, a couple decades behind, and in some of those situations, you know, a few years behind. And so I think all of that culminated at the same time. Prices like Ontario, the Greater Toronto area, those prices have been raising for, you know, decades. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago, before COVID, you know, there was a plot of land that sold for like a couple $1 million in Toronto, and it couldn't have been bigger than like 6 by 8 or something. Like you couldn't even build anything there. So where we are right now is that we are trying to solve an issue that is systemic, and we're being reactive, and we're doing crisis response, and we're not putting enough at the debate. Brian Watt, he gave a really good kind of example that a significant portion of our focus needs to be on prevention, and not just because that's actually what's going to fix things long term, but because you know, it is less expensive, and it's going to have more structural change long term. I think that the numbers are probably significantly higher than we believe. I think HDC's number for March was around 460 people are currently experiencing homelessness in St. John last month. And, approximately half of that are individuals who are chronically homeless, which means that they've experienced more than 6 months of being unhoused.
So, Misty, can I just ask you on that number? I mean, it's a shocking number. I mean, 460 people, but for folks that wouldn't necessarily understand that next piece you added, so a portion, about half, did you say, are chronically homeless? The others are in
Under
and out.
6 months.
So,
No, not necessarily. So the others could be, there's people who, so it's over time. So there's 400 people experiencing some form of homelessness that we know about, we know them by name. And then half of those people have had longer than 6 months. So whether that's, a month here, a year here over the last 3 years, it has added up to longer than 6 months. Or 6 months at a time. There's all kinds of variations, but essentially somebody who has experienced at least 6 months of homelessness. And additionally, those are just the people we know. That's not, we don't often talk about other forms of homelessness and stability. So, we have a significant portion of people who are overcrowded, so precariously housed. We have people who are living in unsafe dwellings. We also have people who are couch surfing or might have friends or family that they can stay with, but it's not an ideal situation, and it could cause, issues long term. Like if a landlord were to find out they're staying there, if other sort of situations, Canada Revenue or social assistance. So we have a significant portion of people that are also precariously housed. And so I think that those numbers are probably significantly higher than what we know about. On top of the issue of homelessness, we have affordability. Everything is expensive. Food prices are astronomical. What a family of 3 might have spent on groceries, 2 years ago, that is getting you probably a quarter of the amount of food. Energy prices have risen, gas has risen. St. John isn't a city where it's easy to get around in. At the debates, everybody talked about transit and how far we've come, which I think is important. The transit system in St. John is not accessible, and it's not easy to use or understand. I have 2 degrees and I still have to get a friend to look up.
Explain this to me. Okay, well, I wasn't going to, I thought it was just me.
No.
Okay, so it's just not easy.
No, and I've lived all across Canada. You can compare, our city and transit system to, and I know people talk about the geography of St. John, but there are other cities where comparisons can be had, and we can do actually some pretty simple things to provide more access. Because, one of the things people talked about was if, we've tried. I think there was something about Redhead. Well, we tried to put, a bus system and nobody used it. But even though we have transit, it's not reliable. One of the times I had a vehicle and it had broke down and I had to go to the west side to No Frills, and I looked it up and confirmed with my friend what time I needed to get that bus, and it did not come within the time that it said it was going to come. So it's not even necessarily that it's accessible, but it's not necessarily reliable. And for people that have to rely on it to get to work, especially for low wage jobs and stuff, that adds a significant portion of unpaid time to their days. And when you have people that have kids and all that kind of stuff. So I think that where we sit right now is that there has been a lot of supports put in place over the last couple of years. But I don't think that they're necessarily addressing the core reasons that people are experiencing such turmoil right now. And I think without that, the situation is genuinely just going to get worse.
So, Misty, just on transit. So I've been to a couple of forums and then watched the others. I find them very difficult to watch, to be honest, having been the mayor and
Yeah.
you know, just understanding how complex it is. I think there's two camps. I mean, I think there's candidates who just genuinely don't know.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and you know, look, our civics, as you know, our voter turnout is abysmally low. It's 30% ish. Thank you to Human Development Council, Civic Tech, and all those groups putting the forums on. They've taken it to another level this year. I mean, just done an absolutely incredible job with that. You know, just the transit piece. So a couple of comments. One is that I don't like candidates, especially those that have been around the table, don't yet realize how difficult that budget piece is. It's, you know, I used the example in the past when I was mayor. I literally went out and bought mason jars. The budget then was $165 million. I bought $165 in loonies and I put them in each jar. And every single person that would come to see me, I'd say, okay, you want to take money, you want more money in your jar. Where is it coming from? It's very, very difficult. But I think I want to pick up on the piece that I had a conversation. This is a while ago, but I suspect it's the same problem. I had a conversation and, you know, I think the premise when you're designing cities is around density and walkability and, you know, people living close. That's why the opportunity with the old North End to carefully rebuild, you know, with affordability in mind. That's why, you know, the
St. John is old and was not built for transportation.
No. And, you know, but we abandoned those inner community neighborhoods. We know, I mean, 40,000 cars come 30 to 40,000 cars a day come in from all over the place outside of the city. That's if you have a car, obviously. And that's why things like, and I mean, please do not let this election be about bike lanes, you know, to the North End. Like, but that's more than that, just slowing down, making streets safer. It's also having a connector for people to be able to get from the North End to the Uptown if you don't own a car. But on the transit piece, like...
and it also saves the roads. I read a really cool article.
100%.
I don't remember the gentleman that wrote it.
Nick Cameron,
but
I think.
But if you block that off so that cars can't drive on it, it doesn't degrade as quickly, and
100%.
therefore it's cheaper, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think your previous comment about St. Johners, I mean, I said one morning on the CBC, St. Johners want everything to change and nothing to change.
Literally, that's the best.
Tough. It's a gritty, I love you, St. John, you're gritty, you're tough, but you need to accept some change here, and you need to gather the facts and the information, and we'll get into a question here in a second. But just to finish my thought on the transit, like, I mean, the budget should reflect the reality of today and the type of city that we need for everyone to participate. And it's a tough gig. And I remember having that chat with someone who called me one day, and I was saying, well, you know, look, I mean, the transit system is better, closer to the core of the city and so on. And it was like one of those like paradigm shifts, or like, I'll never forget the conversation. And she said, no, I get it, Don. I absolutely get it. But I had to move where I moved because it was the only place I could afford to live. It's like, oh, frig. Okay. Right. Because, you know, apartments and all these things have gotten in the core so much more expensive. And then, you know, she had to go out almost to the airport to find an apartment in a basement of a house that she could afford. But now she's stuck because she can't get back to work. So I think it's like keeping all of those things in mind, right?
Agreed. And at one of the debates, or I guess the forum, you know, one of the, I can't remember who it was at the moment because I'm terrible with names, but one of the individuals said, like, you know, people can't just live anywhere they want. And it kind of made me laugh because it's not necessarily about living where you want to live. It's where you can afford to live, you know, where your family might be, where you've grown up. It's the same conversation we have when they ask, you know, should we have supportive housing in all areas or services for unhoused in all areas? Yes, we should, because all of these individuals are from our communities and they shouldn't be forced out of their community because systems have made it so they no longer have a roof over their head.
I'm really glad that you picked that up because I mean, I you know, I didn't know what the questions were going into the forum. It's a tough gig, you know, just to recognize for all the candidates.
100%.
If you've not been around the table and you're there and you're getting those kinds of questions and you have 60 seconds to answer, I mean, it's like, wow, you know, and you live it day in and day out, but I'm really glad to, I mean, I'm very interested in your perspective on that. And, you know, that you've just made me, which is the gift of long form conversation. Think about that differently. Why should I be forced out of the neighborhood where I might have friends friends or
Yeah.
I know people where
Yeah.
maybe I grew up because
Yeah.
the services don't exist
Yeah.
that I need.
Yeah.
And I think we've got experiments that we've done in the past, right? Where we've
Hmm.
brought people who have some of the same socioeconomic challenges and we put them all together.
Yep.
And, there's probably been some success in that, but there's also been some criticism in that.
Yep.
So, so that's a good point. When we look at folks that are unhoused, Misty, it's a two-part question. And I don't have a better word than label, but so who are the people that are experiencing these challenges? Like, I think my sense is that St. Johners and New
Hmm.
Brunswickers think you're addicted. You're mentally ill. You did it to yourself. I
Yeah.
mean, we've seen those kinds of comments. And then how prevalent is or how connected is trauma, mental health, and addiction? And I know I had a conversation one day, with Holly Ann about, just asking questions, trying to learn more. And, one thing she said to me that really resonated was, Don, you can become unhoused and not be addicted or have mental health challenges,
Yeah.
but you'll get them.
100%.
You'll get them. So, yeah. So
Like,
that label, that stigma that we see every day of the week.
I think it's significantly more complex than people recognize. So there's a couple things in play. Seniors are one of the fastest growing demographics of people becoming unhoused. For St. John, there's a significant portion of men who are between the ages of I want to say it's, late 20s to 45. That's the biggest group that are unhoused. Youth, 40% of people experiencing homelessness in St. John have been exited from care.
Wow.
So it's complicated and also convoluted. St. John, and this is why I'm a voracious reader and history is so important. So St. John, many, many decades ago, had communities that were, people who had immigrated to Canada from Europe and European places. We had Irish come here, and we had people there. There was Portuguese communities. There was an Italian community, and there was
Greece.
tenement
Yep.
houses. You had Sheriff's where Hilliard is, I guess, before they put in the viaduct and the bridge. There was a lot of tenement houses over by where Giant Tiger is right now. That was all tenement communities. And those buildings were unsafe. They were poorly built, very prone to fire and not good places for people to raise families, but they were cheap rent and that sort of thing. And so what happened is, I think it was around the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
The urban renewal.
Yeah,
all the
urban
Yep.
renewal happened. And then we pushed people out of these neighborhoods and we created essentially our 5 priority neighborhoods. And so then what you saw was, generations of individuals. The wars had happened at this point. So you had people come back with trauma in that way. You had quite a bit of social change at that time, but I'm not entirely sure it came with such conviction to St. John. And again, because some of the legislations are significantly older. And so you have generations of individuals growing up. And then, in the 90s, there was the, hard, tough on crime, on crack cocaine. It was racist. It was about Black moms and, giving birth to babies addicted to crack cocaine. And so there was this big crackdown on it. And I think then you had the Oxycontin controversy. And so through all that time, I love reading old newspapers in St. John. And I think something that stands out is, there's always been a significant history of alcohol and bootlegging and that kind of stuff. So you had these pockets of poverty. And you have generations of kids growing up in that. The city and, the people in positions of power and privilege, they're the ones that created that. And so we worked really hard to try and do things like, community building. And there was food banks and there was, programs that got put in place to reach out to at-risk kids, and that kind of stuff. So you have people who have grown up in poverty. There's that section of people. You also have people who, have lived East St. John, which has a very different demographic. You have people who have worked in public safety and have long-term health effects. There was, I think it was Elizabeth Weir when she, in the 90s, maybe it was, she proved that like Irving had actually, polluted places.
Hmm.
So you also have a significant portion of people who have health issues and disabilities. You have who are, one small step away from crisis. So those are some people also entering homelessness. You also have, individuals who we had investors from other provinces, like think of all those Huggard buildings in the North End. So they came in, they bought all these properties and then they didn't do anything with them. And the legislation here is behind. We just saw it with Carmarthen Street. That building has been in disrepair since I got here. Everybody has known that that building was in disrepair. And to me, it seems like even the bylaws that we have here in the city of St. John and provincial legislation for like building safety and stuff, there's not enough here that actually makes people do the right thing with their buildings.
So for those, I'm not aware, but I think I probably know. So for those that might not be aware of Carmarthen, so we've
Yeah.
had, is it a rooming house or a
So
building
there
that's,
was mostly rooms, but there
yeah,
was also apartments,
okay,
and they were like the entire time that I've lived here, they've just been in poor shape, and
right.
there's never been anything done to address that. And so what I watched it sort of take place in real time where, you know, this individual tried to advocate for themselves and finally get something to be done about it. And it was it was like a family member of an individual who was living there. And so they really tried hard to get something done about it. But all that happened was the building got shut down
Yeah,
and every single person ended up unhoused.
right.
When the legislation changed for after COVID, there was you couldn't evict anybody. And then they sort of changed the legislation that, you can only evict people for 4 reasons. People had bought all these buildings, sight unseen, and were trying to do things. So we had landlords that one landlord called on themselves because rentalsmen
Oh,
wouldn't let them evict people. So
okay.
they called on themselves and like that building was shut down and 15 people were out on the street. We had a rooming house on the west side multiple times. um, you know, the city would go and shut that building down and say, you have to do this, this, and this, and this if you want to be able to rent this. And then that individual would just do it again,
Hmm.
get caught again. And, and each time it was like 12 to 15 people who ended up on the streets again.
Right.
And then you have things like, think of the building down at the bottom of Waterloo. A dryer vent wasn't cleaned properly and
Hmm.
caught on fire. And it happened to be a really crappy windy day in December. And I stood there that whole entire day and like our firefighters, they really tried, but that took 3 buildings. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? They're balloon frame buildings. So fire spreads very, very quickly. We've had multiple fires in the North End that have just taken out,
Yeah.
entire
Yeah.
homes. And so the people that are living in homelessness are from all different walks of life, from all different backgrounds. They tend to be our neighbors, our parents, our siblings. And some of them, people talk about like, well, they must not have friends and family that they can rely on. And it's not necessarily that. It's that, even if I have parents, if my parents live in subsidized housing, I can't necessarily fall back on them because
Right.
they can't have people live with them or they're going to get evicted. Or, in some of the seniors buildings, if your parents are elderly, you can't necessarily take your 4 kids to a seniors building to go stay with them. And for a significant portion, we have like one of the Maritimes has an aging population. And so, and genuinely not the incomes that support individuals. So it's not necessarily that, somebody doesn't have somebody that wants to help them. It's
Can't,
just
they
that
just
there's
can't,
so many
can't.
people in the same position and, that there's risks to that. I think that the idea that, the only unhoused people we have are substance users and criminals is incorrect.
Right.
I have met people with degrees. I have
Mm.
met people who have been firefighters and paramedics and people that have been nurses. I have met people with just absolute incredible ability, like in the arts, and I've met people with all kinds of insight in, how situations happen. And it is the group of people living unhoused in our community are as complex as our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Um,
What's the weight, as you're, so for two things. First of all, I mean, you've described beautifully the complexity of this city, its roots. I mean, you've looked back at the
mhm,
history as, the indicators, the trauma. I had a conversation with someone and at the Nick Nicole at the forum, I was chatting with someone else and they were waiting. I could
mhm,
tell they wanted to chat with me, and we went over and we chatted, and I won't tell you some of the first part that they said. They were saying like, they're worried. They're worried about, and I'll use the language I used, is the dark history in this city around sexual abuse.
mhm.
Esther Brooks, Snook, others,
Robert,
other like me,
yep,
many, right? I have this in the pit of my stomach because I worked on this when I was
mhm,
mayor, and then you fall off, and then I've recently been having conversations about it, and I was asking myself like, what? Not only what have we learned, because that's one thing, but thank you, okay, but how have we safeguarded? Because there's like you're learning. Yeah, we've learned a
yeah,
lot of lessons, but if we don't ingrain
yeah,
those, right, those in the system, then we're set for it again. And
mhm,
I don't know if it's just here, Misty, you'd probably know better than me, but we love folk heroes in the city, right? We love to put people on pedestals.
mhm,
And that's what we did. And, with Donnie Snook, right?
mhm,
I mean, he was feeding kids, he was doing all of these things
yep,
and taking advantage of some of the folks that had those traumas that wanted better for their kids, and these opportunities to participate and go do activities
mhm,
and so on. And and I don't want to go off on a tangent there in terms of some of the safeguards. Maybe that's a different discussion, but I mean, it may be all integrated like you've just described over the last 5-10 minutes about just how complex this is, how deeply it goes back in our history, and all
mhm,
of the cascading elements of how someone may be unhoused, that they had full-time jobs, that
mhm,
they were serving the community in a variety of ways. And I guess it leads me into this sort of the stigma. I mean, I suppose you've just helped people better understand who are the folks that are unhoused. I hope you have maybe picked away at the labeling that so
yeah,
many people, why don't they just get a job?
yeah,
What's wrong with these people? How come they don't just pull up their
yeah,
bootstraps,
yeah,
like because they've got a 10,000 pound weight on their
yeah.
shoulders to try to navigate this piece around the
For the
addictions.
people that are
Yeah.
like, "Why don't they just get a job?" I wanna come to your house,
Yeah.
I wanna sit beside your bed, and I just wanna, like, yell randomly through the night, and then I want you to get up at 6 o'clock every morning. I
Yeah.
want you to trek across town because you
Yeah.
can't afford transit. I want you to go to a labor job for 12 hours.
Yeah.
Then we're gonna go back to your house, I'm gonna sit beside your bed, and
Yell.
I'm just gonna scream as loud as I possibly
Mm.
can at random intervals,
Well,
and at the end of 6 days, I wanna see how, like,
yeah. How you
how
feeling?
good you feel.
How you feeling? Wow.
Yeah, how are you gonna get to work on Monday?
That was really powerful. You just reminded me, was it Julia Woodhull Melnick, or which group put, the immersive at the old museum site a few years ago? There was a forum that happened. I don't know if you ever saw it, but it was to bring someone like me who hasn't
Mhm.
had that experience into the world of what it's like. And you went into this sort of,
That was for the I think it was the youth,
yes, perhaps.
that was the harm reduction symposium,
Okay.
and I think CYC put
Maybe
on
it
a
was.
youth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you basically, for those that didn't see that, you went in through this, like you bent down, you went in, and you
Mhm.
went into different stages through this,
Yeah.
this walk through, and
Yes.
of folks, the trauma, the maybe abuse, and then couch surfing, and then
Mhm.
being homeless, and it really was incredibly impactful, just
Yeah.
as you've just described, Misty. And And I just think, yeah, like if we can, the one thing we need to make sure, and it doesn't always show up, I've seen it online, I've seen you push back against it. I've, at length, I can't imagine, because I have another question for you here in a second. But, so people label, people stigmatize, why don't they
Yeah.
just get a job, all that stuff. And you've just done a great job there. The addictions piece. And as expected, I thought some candidates in this election, and actually not as many as I thought would come out to
Yeah.
say kind of the lock them up,
Yeah.
we're handing out, drugs like candy, all that kind of stuff. What do you think it's important for folks to understand around addictions and the response to addictions? And if I can use this language, and please correct me on anything I say, meeting people where they're at to stabilize so that we can then start some healing?
Well, I think that it's always interesting to me that people are so significantly focused on the addiction that lives on the street, that is unhoused and visible. Because if you actually look at rates across Canada of substance use, we are a country that likes our substances, whether it's, food, alcohol, pharmaceutical drugs, illicit drugs. We have always been a country that likes our substances. And anybody, I don't care who you are, when it gets to a point that you are using those substances to cope and it becomes problematic, that it's affecting other areas of your life, that's when it becomes an issue. And so what happens is HDC did some data points a few years ago. I think it was from a point in time count. And what they found was that even individuals, people who entered homelessness and were not substance users, within 2 months of being unhoused, 80% of people were using substances.
Anne was
And
sharing. Yeah.
it's because it's horrible. I mean,
It's survival. It's
yeah,
coping.
it is how we cope with things. It's how we cope with being cold, how we cope with being hungry, how we cope with having absolutely zero privacy, the lack of dignity, and the trauma that you experience around it. And so when we think it's a huge frustration for me because, yes, we 100% have people using substances on our streets. But we don't have safe injection sites here. We don't actually have safe consumption sites. We have medication alternatives for people who are trying to limit or um, not use it all.
So like methadone, things like
Yes,
that.
there's methadone to abuse for people that use alcohol. IOT, there's different medication. There's some for amphetamines. There's a lot of different things, and we see. I mean, we have we also see it with smoking cessation and all that kind of stuff. It's the exact same thing. It is a medical way to help people with cravings and that sort of thing. It's just a different level. So there seems to be this big push on, because we're seeing it, but it's actually like a small portion of the population. I want to say it's something around 4%. And it's even smaller than that because, for a long time, St. John didn't have spaces where the unhoused could go. So it was very, very visible and it was very, very, in the street because there was nowhere that they could go. And we have a lot of evidence to support things, but we don't actually have them in practice. We don't have detox beds available. We don't have rehabilitation available. We don't have mental health services available. We don't even have counseling available that's accessible. And some agencies are doing a lot to combat that. We have students who are going to places and offering low cost or cheaper services. We have some agencies that have offered free or low cost services, but then still exists like transportation and all that kind of stuff. And
So
people,
when you say, sorry, Misty, just to clarify, when you say not available, do you mean at the scale that we need to
yeah, and not
respond to? Yeah,
accessible.
right.
If somebody on the east side of St. John has a, clinic and they're doing free therapy on Fridays from like 1 to 4.
Yeah.
Cool. But
do you
how
get
am I
that?
going to get there from Waterloo Street?
Right.
And part of the pushback with that is that people, they're getting free money because they're getting their welfare check. Standard welfare check is like $680.
Hmm.
And if you look at the cost of food, if you look at the cost of, and everybody says that, all these agencies they're giving out a significant portion of that in kind stuff that's given out is like donated stuff. And you'd be amazed. We have, people that are getting rid of their clothing and they're coming and bringing like dress clothes and high heels and, that kind of stuff to donate to people that are living rough. And, so there's still things that people have to purchase for themselves. People talk about a lot of food being given out, and Romero House is amazing, but they're open 7 days a week, but that's one meal a
Hmm.
day. There's a couple of the churches have 5 meals a day. Then we have some people who church groups or street team, they're only giving out like 25 meals a night, and we have upwards of 500
Hmm.
people who are unhoused. So that is still not enough for people to eat enough to,
To
not be hungry,
sustain.
that kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
Yeah.
And so substance use works as a way to just not feel any of that
Numb.
stuff.
To numb.
And
Yeah.
yeah, to numb it. And I think that meeting people where they're at, again, back to the history, we we have a city. So you had Dr. Roberts, Donnie Snook, Carl Toff, Kenneth
Estabrook.
Estabrook, and each group had upwards of, in the hundreds of individuals who were affected by that. And then you have systems down the road who like, no, we don't believe you.
Hmm.
We're going to take this. I think for Bobby Hayes, the court case was filed in 2013. It's 2026. And so then you had a city and I get the reasons behind insurance and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like it was a choice because, capitalism. Um, what that looked like to people was, we don't believe you and we don't care. And so when you look at the history and the life expectancy of people who have grown up in St. John, a lot of these individuals are not alive anymore. And you have a small group of people who have just dealt with so much harm and trauma that they're probably never going to be sober. And I'm not sure I would be able to living some of the things that they have lived through, you
Hmm.
know? And so what do we do then? Do we just like leave them to, well, the place for you is jail or the place for you is on the street? And then we also have, center care was closed and there was a lot of talk from the government of that time, that we're going to invest in community, because of institutionalization and a lot of the harms that happened because of those institutions, you know, it it was kind of to give it that overview and the community care and connect people because human beings are packed animals. We cannot do things alone. And a portion of those people were put into community, but all those supports that they said they were going to implement didn't happen. And not only did they not happen, but then like down the road, governments that then came into power actually cut those services and supports even more. And so, we are a community, we're a country, we're a world of so much information at the tip of our fingers now. And so a lot of the stuff we see and hear is sensationalized. Um, we actually only have like a handful of individuals that have significant mental health, who would be their behaviors in community would be outside of what is, socially acceptable. You see videos posted on Facebook all the time of people who are screaming and doing, weird body movements and such. And if you look at the comments on those, you have like 300-400 comments about
Hmm.
people and, they just say horrific things. But those are people who um, don't have the cognitive capacity and we don't care
Hmm.
because we're just lumping it all together. So meeting people where they're at is essentially, it's not saying like, what the hell is wrong with you? It's saying like, what happened to you um, for this to be, you are,
Yeah.
listening to people when they say, this is what I need, we need to listen to them because, when I spoke about that small group of people that are probably never going to stop using. So should we treat them less than human, or should we still assist them? Does that mean that they don't deserve housing? They don't deserve this? That's
Mhm.
not accurate. I know a lot of people who live fulfilling lives while still medicating
Yeah.
with their substances for their trauma. They go to work, they have beautiful apartments, they plant gardens, they spend time with family members, they have community connections. I myself, I'm 21 years sober.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? I think that it's incredibly important that people, they are the experts in their own lives and they know what they need or what works for them. And we need to listen to that, because the things that we can do to address and help things, and it's simple things, I've had people who, with housing, like, we kind of, it seems that we sort of look at people and we say, I know what you need and I'm going to give it to you and you're going to be happy with it. But if somebody's saying, like, you can't put me in an apartment uptown because then all the people that I know that I, want to get away from are going to come to my house and I'm going to feel bad and I'm not going to be able to say, no, you can't come in. And then we're like, well, if you don't take this apartment, sucks to be you. And when we don't listen to people about what they need, and then those things happen and we blame it on them, you know what I mean? I don't really know what we expect.
Misty, most folks, especially those that are not living it, right? And I've had occasion to speak with, parents who, and again, I think through storytelling is very powerful,
Mhm.
to humanize that,
Mhm.
you know, I can't imagine the weight that you and those others who work on the front line carry, knowing that all
Mhm.
of the folks, friends, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, fathers who've died year after year,
Mhm.
right? In reduction symposiums, first 10 minutes is reading out lists of
Yep.
names.
Yep.
And, you know, I can't imagine, the weight of that. So, I mean, I just want to ask you about sort of the criticism that comes. And then I want to ask you about,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I don't know, like there's lots of solutions
Yep.
out there, but and then we'll try to wrap up because we've been at it a long time. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries.
It's deeply complex. This is what I think about all the time. We've been at it for so long. Romero House is serving more meals now than they did,
Yep.
40 years. Like 40 years they've been at this.
Mhm.
And we have this, I don't like the word ecosystem, but we have this ecosystem of, frontline organizations and on the street. And then a new group pops up,
Mhm.
the street team and all this stuff. And sometimes I'm so grateful. And I
Mhm.
think, oh my gosh, like how do we, the advice is out there, the solutions are out there. There's the will to say that well-being in our community, social equity in our community does matter.
Mhm.
And we are going to address this, because as you mentioned, Brian, I think the same way. Like, how can I usually talk about root cause, but prevention, right? Because, we're just working, like we're just rowing and rowing and rowing and rowing. And sometimes it feels like we're not making any progress. So how do we get at, sort of those root causes? So when it comes to, so I'm going to ask you in a minute about the solutions that work, but there's a lot of criticism
Yep.
of individuals, which we've just talked about. You've helped us better understand the stories and how easily anyone can be there
Mhm.
themselves. But the frontline agencies are often criticized. What does that, you know, what does that feel like, I guess? Is some of it fair? What part of it is just absolute bullshit? Because you haven't sworn once, like, not that I see you swear a whole lot
I
in
do swear.
okay, like
Yeah.
there's gotta be one swear word in this podcast.
I think, I mean, I feel like I have a lot of compassion for people
Mhm.
because I can see things from a lot of different sides. And so, you know, I have kids. My son's bike was stolen. I was pissed. I'm a single mom and couldn't afford it. So I drove around until I, found the person that had that bike and I walked into, at the time it was Chuck's,
Yeah.
And, with my mad face was like, whose bike is that? And nobody would answer. So I was like, well, it's my son, so I'm taking it.
Yeah.
And so I can understand some people's frustration. I think the hardest part, and it's different for other people because I know a lot of people that do the work, and I know, they are kept up at night, by the things that they know, and I have comforted colleagues, from government spaces to nonprofit who have cried with the losses. I have had to look in parents' eyes, um, and tell them, you know, things that I would hope to never hear. And there's also with this population, the hardest part is that a significant portion of people don't realize how biased we are and how we just treat people. Anybody that knows me knows that my signature outfit is a hoodie and jogging pants.
Mhm.
And when I'm, with people who look like me, the treatment is significantly different, and that from people in positions of power like police, doctors, nurses, other professionals, and it significantly changes based on some biases. But the confidentiality that exists, especially in a town like St. John, which is unique in the fact that it is bigger, but it's still like a small town vibe. There's a lot of things, rumors. What's that saying? A rumor gets halfway around the world
Mhm.
before the truth has its chance to get its shoes on,
Mm.
and I kind of joke that if I ever go out in a flame of glory, it's going to just be like pointing things out because, um, you know, the amount of people who have received services and tend to be the loudest critiques online,
Mhm.
or the individuals that people in helping professions know so many secrets. And it's always funny to me seeing who is the most vocal because we tend to know a lot of things that we are never allowed to say. And so I tend to not take it personally. And the reason for that is because I recognize that human beings, we have pattern recognition. It is how our brains work is to make things make sense. And the easiest thing to do is to, and I mean, throughout history, we've done this, we have always othered a group.
Mhm.
We've seen it with, Indigenous, Black, LGBTQ, throughout history. We have always picked another, and poor, really, in every civilization, except maybe some indigenous populations, that has always been, one to pick on. And
So in some ways, what you're saying is we're just repeating old patterns in our history,
some of it,
stigmatizing, demonizing, blaming,
yeah,
othering, right?
some of it,
Yeah.
and it also separates us because it is so much easier to be mad than
Mm.
it is to be vulnerable.
Oh,
And I think, and you see it if you'll see the pattern now that I pointed it out. But if you look online and you see some of these comments, some of the ones are like, my favorites are I always call it the like ex-smoker type personality, well, I got sober, so you can too. But you'll see it like, well, I used to be homeless and I never did that.
yeah.
Or, they should be able to like clean up after themselves, or like, do you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
all these things that are said. And it's like a moral superiority. Like, even if I was homeless, I would pick up my garbage. Okay,
Mm.
cool. Well, what garbage bag are you going to put it in?
Mm.
What garbage receptacle are you going to put it in? Your feet have blisters, and the closest one, because if you actually look Waterloo Village, there are no garbage bins.
Right. Right.
What are you going to do? You're going to walk all the way to King Street with blisters on your feet? So, I mean, it definitely takes a toll. I think that people burn out of this field faster than anything I've seen. And it's probably the same thing with like helping professions. And especially this constant, like, what has to happen, what we need to do, and you escalate it and you see something happening, especially the deaths, like this is going to happen. And there's just nowhere, like nothing gets done. It's like screaming into a void. And I think that's the hardest thing because we know when it's going to happen. And so that's infuriating. Some of the bullshit is just, I was never I've never been like, I was never popular in school. You know, I had my group of friends and I did well. Mm, I was never, I was kind of always the person that like didn't know when to not say something, or like I was always the person that said what everybody's thinking, but like, I don't know. I didn't really care about comfort. I would call out the elephant in the room.
Do you see that as a strength?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I don't feel bad about it. And I think that it's the like what is bullshit is that I wish, and we have so many people in St. John that I admire and I think are brilliant. But, you know, we have people that jump on the bandwagon about certain things. And for a long time, there was only like a few people that would like push back. And I understand why that is, because some of those, you know, it just turns into like uncivilized drivel. So I get that. But then in, you know, public spaces, in council meetings, you know, we saw a gentleman for a while who, you know, was talking about the unhoused and all that kind of stuff. You know, one week they're holding up a sign for somebody who died. And, you know, a couple weeks later, it's like, down with all the community agencies supporting this because this is their fault. And, you know, we had city councilors and we had other people in positions of power that just like bought into that. And what's bullshit is that the evidence exists. The data is there. Recently, in the last 24 hours, actually, I just did a post about it. You know, this violent crime crap about St. John is one of the safest cities.
Yeah.
You know, the crime rate has gone down. If you actually look at the clearance rate for violent crimes in St. John police do amazing. I think they're like 100% clearance rate on murders in St. John. And if you look at the news stories for every single one of those were like complicated personal relationship type situations. Nobody is just like going around and killing people. And a significant portion of violent crime, like, so that's like robbery with weapon. So that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, somebody got stabbed or hurt or anything. That if somebody had a weapon and like, you know, and it could be as simple as, give me your money, cool, I'm walking away. Doesn't actually mean violence happened. And so, you know, when people steal when they're desperate and, you know, those things happen. They've happened throughout all civilization. But I just feel like certain people in positions of power, they do not have the ignorance to pull and say and support some of this, you know, I don't even know what to call it, just bullshit
Yeah.
that kind of goes around because it exists. And I think there are good conversations. One of the candidates said it. It's definitely is a feeling of safety. And that's going to be very different for women. It's going to be very different for elderly. It's going to be very different, you know, for kids, people with histories of trauma, that sort of thing. So I understand the feeling of safety is very different for everybody. But I think that there's a way that we can have these conversations without pushing this rhetoric of, you know, fear mongering
Yeah.
or blowing things out
Yeah.
of proportion.
Well, and I think that's our politics today, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I woke up this morning to a federal MP sharing a half-baked story attacking the transgender community. It's just like we, you know,
Yeah.
especially leaders in the community,
Yeah.
which means elected, non-elected others.
Yeah.
You know, we have to start from a basis of fact. And I'm a big believer of trying to define what success looks like. You know, what are we trying to achieve here? Because I mean, we can just go around in circles, but we've seen the rise of you know, the rhetoric and all of those things that are happening that aren't grounded. They aren't grounded in fact. They aren't grounded in data.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a famous, I think it was back in the 80s, Monahan, I think he was a senator in the US, and there was a debate happening. And he said, like, you, sir, are entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. And we
Yeah,
see a lot of opinion
precisely.
today and in rage and, you know,
Yeah.
shared as, and these issues are complex, right? So we'll get to wrap up. A couple of just last thing, we should have spent more time on this piece, but you are providing such beautiful context for people who don't understand this issue to better understand this issue, right? But if you were the boss or if you had the pen, what few things would you do that would make a profound difference on everything we just talked about?
So this is my favorite thing. We talk about this continuum of care. Okay. But we don't actually have a continuum of care because a continuum of care suggests that people move
It's a
along
constant.
this continuum, right?
Yeah.
What we have is we, you know, discharge people from care when they're too much. And what I think we should be doing is escalating or de-escalating people across the continuum of care.
Yeah.
So, and we can do this in all places. So somebody who is given an eviction notice, what is that eviction notice for? It's just rent. Okay. You are escalated to the services. Like, I don't understand why we have people being evicted for not being able to afford rent. There should be an escalation to services that can, if your apartment is too expensive for you, there should be a solution where you are moved into a more sustainable situation. If, there is, a structural issue and your place is not safe, there should be where it escalates. And the same thing when it becomes behavior. And we do it we're very siloed, and it's because we're getting better. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's like we're fighting over pieces for money and funding and that kind of thing. And so what I would like to see is a more comprehensive continuum. And what that would look like is that, if somebody is having these issues, because housing is a human right, if somebody is having these issues, we don't take away a service from them like a house, a basic necessity. What we do is like, what does this person need? And whether that's connecting them with supportive services and like escalating that. It's the same thing. If a program that does the highest acuity says this person needs clinical care, there should be a way to escalate that person instead of, discharging them from services. And what I have found across Canada is that as a community, we have our set of this is what is okay and this is what is not okay. And we exclude people when they don't fit what we have said is okay. And we also apply that logic to our services. We exclude people when they are too much or can't fit within certain criteria. And what we need to be doing is escalating them to more complex clinical services that can address those. And then the people that are, getting complex services and stabilized and don't need them, those people should be able to de-escalate down that continuum of care to, less intensive support. And you could do that from we do this. Like, if you go in and break your leg, you immediately are with the doctor and they fix the bone, do the surgery, whatever. And then you're de-escalated to like a therapist.
Yeah, we do it.
And then,
okay, interesting. Really great point. We do it every single day in certain categories.
Yes.
Other categories that are life impacting.
Right.
We have stops and starts.
Right. Yeah. And all of the things exist.
Yeah.
We have clinical care. We have psychiatrists. We have central care. We have, and once it gets more difficult, we're like, no. You know what I mean? And it makes no sense to me. Yeah. So what I think we could do that would save a ton of money is just really, truly practice a continuum of care.
Right. And match our actions with our words.
Yes. Yeah. Because then we're not solving crisis. And, we can be preventative.
Okay. I want to end with a rapid fire. What keeps you going?
Spite. No, I thrive at a spite. Yeah. No, honestly, what keeps me going is that I genuinely believe people are good. I know some absolutely incredible humans from all walks of life, and we live in an incredible, beautiful city that has history and character, and it is full of unique and fun individuals. And I don't think that I've ever felt more at home in a place than I've been everywhere. So really what keeps me going is all the phenomenal humans that I know.
Awesome. You may have just touched on that. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is my daughter is third year at STU right now. And I have had the privilege to meet a lot of her friends. And I've also had placement students who've worked with me. And what gives me hope is the next generation is smarter than us and kinder than us.
Yeah, I agree. That's beautiful. What's one thing you wish people understood?
That not everything you read on the internet is true.
Yeah. Critical thinking, right?
Yes.
Yeah. If we want better outcomes, we have to be willing to look clearly at what's working, what isn't, and what it will take to change course. Conversations like this are where it starts, I think. And you've been having these conversations, not where it starts. You have these conversations every day. I watch you engage. I'm inspired by you. I'm grateful to you and to all of those others. As you say, we have a group on the front line in this community that are world class, in my opinion, and we ought to. And we need to, not only as citizens, but policy setters, elected officials at all levels, recognize that you're tired, that you're a bit worn out, the weight of knowing people who you've advocated for, who've lost their battle.
Preventatively. Like, could have been prevented.
And something that really struck me, and just sort of end here, is that my mom died a couple of years ago now, and she was such a incredible. You would have loved my mother. An incredible woman, caring, spent her whole career nursing, variety of jobs. Worked in government for a while with social development, couldn't stand the bureaucracy, private therapist, went back and did her PhD in her 60s. Just a life of empathy and care for others. And mom died very, very suddenly, was diagnosed and died 20 days later from cancer. And one of the things that for me was so important, we started a foundation in her name because I wanted her name to be said out loud.
I love that.
And it struck me that all those who have passed, who's saying their name out loud, who was there an obituary, it's heartbreaking to me that fellow citizens, that we were in the spot that we're in. We can do better, and we have to do better. So Misty, thank you so much for coming today, sharing so much. I hope that for those that actually will listen, it's hard to get people's attention these days. We've spoken for longer than I anticipated, but I'm glad we did. We'll break this conversation into a whole bunch of bite-sized pieces. So for those that can take in 30-second snippets, we'll give them lots of 30-second snippets, some 2 and 3 minute snippets. And for those, I hope that will watch this who are sitting back and trying to better understand the challenges and the complexity of those fellow citizens that are unhoused, that are dealing with mental health and addictions. And I ask those that watch to be empathetic and to be graceful and to ask yourself, how far am I away, if I look left or look right in our own families, to someone in our own families being in the exact same spot? So I think and my answer is we're only just an inch or two away from that.
100%.
Yeah. So thanks so much.